Hey from West Virginia. All right, guys, you ready for joke of the day? Of course you are, because it's the best part of the day. So what do you call a dinosaur with an extensive vocabulary? A thesaurus. All right, let's extend our vocabulary into the idea of absolute value. Well, first we need to understand what the definition of absolute value is. It means the distance from zero on the number line. So if you have a number line looking like this, and here is that zero on the number line, when you're talking about absolute value of a number, you're saying whether that number be up here, how far is that number from zero on the number line, or whether that number be back here, how far is that number from zero on the number line. So it just depends on which side of the number line it is. What you need to understand is we are talking about distance from zero on that number line. And when you talk about distance, you're not talking about negative or positive, because remember, the idea of negative positive simply designates which side of the number line you're talking about. If you're talking about a positive number, its position is up here. If you're talking about a negative number, its position is back here. So remember, say for instance a 5 and a negative 5, they have the same distance. Because to get that negative 5, what we did is we took this distance of 5 and flipped that distance back this much to create that position, and said let's throw a negative on it to show that it's on that side of the number line. So because of that, when you talk about absolute value, it's really neither positive nor negative. Now, that is very important to understand, because what a lot of people do is they'll say, well, to get absolute value, you just simply make it positive. Well, that's the shortcut that you can take, but that's not truly what's happening. What really is happening is you're talking about distance, and distance is neither positive nor negative. So let's go with this idea. Now, the symbol for absolute value is these two bars, and whenever you see those two bars wrapped around a number like you see right here, that simply tells you, okay, this 203, how far is that 203 away from this zero on that number line? So in these examples where it says find the absolute value, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, that 203 is 203 units away from zero on the number line. Notice I did not say positive 203. I said 203 units from zero on the number line. Neither positive nor negative. So let's take a look at this one. The negative 203, again with those absolute value bars around it, says how far is that from zero on the number line? Well, negative 203 is sitting back here. It's 203 units away from zero on the number line. Again, I'm not talking about positive or negative, just 203 units. And then this one says, okay, how far is zero from zero on the number line? How far is zero from itself on the number line? It's nowhere from itself. It's 0 units from itself on the number line. So that is how we deal with absolute value, simply meaning distance from zero on that number line. Okay, so now let's take this idea of absolute value and let's extend it a bit in order to talk about distance between a couple of numbers on the number line. Now what confuses people is they go, okay, when I'm talking about distance between a couple of points, distance is going to be absolute value. So a lot of people will say, well, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the absolute value of one number, take the absolute value of the other number, and then find that distance between those two. But you've got to think about what these actually mean. So in order to get the, say for instance, the distance, let's take this example here. Find the distance between the following numbers. We've got 3 examples we're going to do. So when I say find the distance between a 3 and a 6 on the number line, well, let's picture that number line. So here's the 0, here's the 3, here's the 6. And I want this distance right in here. In order to find that distance, what I could do is I could say, well, I'm going to go up from a 3 to a 4 to a 5 to a 6. I took 3 jumps in order to get up to that 6. So therefore, the distance between a 3 and a 6 is a 3. But the other way to do this is to say, well, how about I take the difference of the two numbers and then I take the absolute value of that, because I'm talking about units and not signs. So in other words, let's take this 6, let's subtract that 3, go from a 6 to a 3, and let's subtract them. Subtracting them gives me a 3, and now let's say how far that is from 0 on the number line. And that gives me an absolute value, a distance of 3. This is actually how you get the distance between two numbers. You simply take the absolute value of their difference. So in other words, you subtract the two numbers, and then you take the absolute value of that to be able to ignore the sign. So let's take a look at this one. I want to get the distance between a negative 5.4 and a negative 1.2. Well, if I look at that number line, and here's the number line, here's 0, that negative 1.2 is going to sit right here, and that negative 5.4 is going to sit right here. I want this distance right in here. So what I could do is I could say, well, I'm going to jump back a unit and another unit and another unit and then portions of a unit. So I'm going to go back that far. But the other way to do it is to say, well, let's find the difference between the two. Let's take that negative 5.4. Let's subtract that negative 1.2. And let's take the absolute value of that. Now, when you subtract a negative, you know that that means add a positive. And so now I'm going to take a negative 5.4 plus a positive 1.2. Negative 5.4 plus positive 1.2 gives me a negative 4.2. And now when I get the absolute value of that negative 4.2, I simply get a 4.2. Now you may be, and so the distance between a negative 1.2 and a 5.4 is going to be a 4.2. In other words, if I would kick back 4 units, that would give me back to a negative 5.2. Then I would have to kick back another 0.2 units to get back to that negative 5.4. And again, I'm not talking about positive or negative, so that's why the absolute value is there, is to be able to ignore the sign and just deal with units of distance. Now, some of you may be asking, well, wait a minute, what if I take that negative 1.2 and subtract the 5.4 and I subtract the other direction? Will that mess things up? Well, let's take a look at that and see. Let's switch this around. And let's do that negative 1.2 minus the negative 5.4. And once again, subtracting a negative really means adding a positive. And so now I'm going to take that negative 1.2 plus 5.4, and we'll take the smaller from the larger. Negative 1.2 from 5.4 is still 4.2, but now I'm going to take the sign of the larger. Now it's the absolute value of a positive 4.2. Well, again, that just simply means how far is 4.2 from 0 on the number line? It's 4.2 units. So it doesn't matter the order that you subtract, just subtract the 2, take the absolute value of that difference in order to get the distance between those two numbers. So now let's take a look at these fractions. Once again, what I'm dealing with here is, here's my number line. Now in this case, here's the 0. Negative 2/3 is back on this end of the number line. Positive 1/3 is up on this end of the number line. So I'm going to kick back a third. I'm going to kick back another 2/3 of a unit. And a third and 2/3 should be the equivalent of 1 unit. Well, let's take a look at this idea, finding that difference and getting the absolute value of it. So if I go with that rule and I subtract, and we just proved that it does not matter the order that you subtract, I'm going to go like this. And now, since the signs are the same, I'm going to combine the numbers. 2/3 and 1/3 gives me 3/3, and I'm going to take that sign. That gives me a negative 1, and I want the absolute value of negative 1, which is in fact a positive 1. Well, sorry, not a positive 1. Absolute value means distance. So I'm just talking units, but it's 1 unit away. And like we said before, sure, I can switch up the order that I subtract, and I can say, let's take that 1/3, subtract the negative 2/3. And subtracting a negative is really adding a positive. So 1/3 plus 2/3 will be a positive 3/3, which is just a 1. And again, the absolute value of 1 is 1. So that proves what I suspected would be the case. Kicking back a third, kicking back 2/3 would be a unit of 1. That would be the distance between the two. So hopefully this helps with finding the distance between two numbers on the number line. Have a great day.